Okay, well, good morning, everybody. It's absolutely fantastic to have you all here with us. My name is Niamh McDade. I'm a professor of forensic science, and I'm the director of the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science. I'm really, really proud and pleased that we're able to host this event, which is the culmination of a really interesting piece of work that Professor Angela Daly has been the lead on. I'm going to pass you over now to Angela so that she can properly kick off the discussion.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much to everyone for coming. Thanks for a lovely welcome, Professor McDade. Just one thing we have to say at the very outset is that this, a reminder that this is going to be recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, bear that in mind, and maybe, if you want to leave the meeting as a result, that's obviously a bit disappointing, but fine as well. But just a reminder that this webinar is going to be recorded. So thanks to everyone for coming. We've got a really good program ahead of us today. This is a webinar about cybersecurity, surveillance and journalism, drawing on two projects, one from our collaborators in Australia and one that we have been running over this last year in Scotland, interviewing journalists, and in the Australian case, some other people adjacent to journalism to try and find out what their attitudes and understandings are of cybersecurity issues and also surveillance issues. By the way, there's a few people with their microphones on. Can people please just mute themselves if they're not speaking? Thank you, because you have the power to unmute yourself as well. So please just mute if you're not speaking. Heather, could I please have the slides up as well just now? Okay, thanks. And yeah, please go forward a few slides too. Okay, here, sorry, go back one. Okay, so firstly, we've had a welcome. We're going to have two presentations from each of the project teams. We're going to kick off with a presentation from our colleagues in Australia. That's Dr. Diarmaid Harkin and Dr. Monique Mann, who are based at Deakin University. And then myself and my project team based at the University of Dundee and the University of Glasgow will talk about our work. And then we have a fantastic panel discussion coming up with international multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder experts to discuss, we hope, some of the themes of our research, but also to position these issues in a broader context beyond just Australia and just Scotland and the UK. So our panelists are Nick Sunil-Williams from the Index on Censorship, Dr. Lachlan Choi from the Citizen Lab, Alan Grieg from the Brim Centre, and Anjali Shear from the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. Once we've all spoken a bit, there will then be hopefully plenty of time for a general discussion, audience questions and answers and comments as well. I know there's quite a few people in the audience who have their own professional and research interests in these topics, so we're really keen to hear from you as well. But if we skip over a few slides, Heather, without further ado, I would like to go to our Australian colleagues and give them the floor, please.
Thanks, Angela. I'm just going to share my slides and hopefully that'll come through, and I'll crash through this in 15 minutes, so someone give me a shout if I'm going over. So yes, thank you guys for joining us today. So what I'm going to present upon is a report that Dr. Monique Mann and I have put together, and we're actually doing a bit of an official launch next week. So this is a bit of a preview of what we've been up to, and it is on the theme of what I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with, which is about this idea of journosec. The basic underlying problem here is, of course, that journalists face unique challenges in the contemporary age in terms of surveillance and cybersecurity threats. I think this is most being brought into really stark relief and stark illustration over the last 12 months in particular around a lot of the revelations of the Pegasus project led up by Amnesty International, but of course must recognize the work of the Citizen Lab, which have been done terrific work in identifying a lot of what NSO Group in particular have been up to, and how a lot of their spyware products, particularly Pegasus, has been often used and deployed, as the information down here in the bottom left shows, against journalists in particular, who are a group who get targeted by these very in the NSO's case, kind of high-end threats by a lot of authoritarian regimes and so on. But even kind of more mundane than that, a lot of other journalists need to be thinking clearly and thoroughly about what they're doing in terms of how they're conducting their online communications and so on. They need to think about what their data in transit effectively. They need to think about what communication networks they're using, what traces that does that leave, what ways in which they might inadvertently tip off sources or reveal whistleblowers, or otherwise give away things that they might not want to give away in the conduct of their normal journalism practice. In Australia, this has a more specific implication around, in Australia, we have a metadata retention scheme, which I'll explain a bit more in a second. But basically, we know from the Australian example that, say, for instance, the Australian Federal Police are regularly using their powers to be able to access the metadata of journalists in Australia in a way in which they're obviously attempting to spy on them and track their activities and their negotiations and contacts and communications with sources. And it's something that is that should be at least high on the mind of a lot of journalists here. Not only do they have to think about their data in transit, but increasingly as well, they also have to think about things like their data at rest. How do they store, analyze, and publish from confidential material? Because obviously, for a lot of journalists, they handle really, radioactive material in a confidential sense, in terms of it's often the nature of what they're focusing on, and they need to be very careful about how they handle that data as well. And in Australia, again, we know that this is a particularly pressing issue, because in Australia, some of you may or may not know, a few years back, there was a major raid by the Australian Federal Police, the equivalent of like the FBI or the onto the ABC, the public broadcaster here, chasing down some journalists and their sources around a series of stories around alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, which are currently being prosecuted. It probably won't surprise anyone that the reporting has turned out to be fairly accurate, and yet the AFP went after the reporters involved. And as you can see from these particular pictures, I've lost. They had a situation where the AFP actually showed up at the offices of the ABC and was actually going through the email archive of a lot of different reporters there, and the picture on the right, as you can see, is one of the AFP officers bagging up some USB sticks as well in order to conduct subsequent forensics on them, in order to decide whether or not they were going to charge these particular reporters. So that's something that obviously reporters need to think about. In Australia, there's something going on in particular where over the last couple of years, there's been a real ramping up of the electronic surveillance capabilities of various law enforcement agencies. These are the four major pieces of legislation we've focused on that have really prompted us to do the report at this time in particular. I'll kind of do a blitz through them in terms of what they are, but our report covers them in a kind of fuller version. So I think one of the first pieces of legislation that we wanted to talk about was introduced back in 2015, which is generally known as the Metadata Retention Act. Here in Australia, we have a situation where internet service providers are basically just mandated to have bulk collection of people's internet activities and internet communications in a way that has been shot down in places like the United States and parts of Europe as well. But in Australia, they've kind of gotten away with it. A key point behind this is that even though internet service providers are scooping up all this data, just bulk, broadly, indiscriminate way, and it includes a heap of information about the source of communication, destination, etc., which obviously can have really important implications for journalists, because journalists or their sources might be leaving clear traces of their activity online. And all these agencies over on the right, by the way, have warrantless, and I'll repeat that again, warrantless access to this metadata. They do not need to apply to a judge or anything to access the metadata. They can just kind of ping it themselves. They have an individual called an authorizing officer that within their own agency, and they basically are then able to just scoop up the data and have a look at what's a random Australian up to. And this, of course, could be important for journalists and their sources. Australia has done a number of kind of eye-popping things when it comes to electronic surveillance. The other thing that followed then in 2018 was what was largely known as the Anti-Encryption Law, where the former Attorney General George Brandis was trying to implement a law which would allow law enforcement or intelligence to basically decrypt communications. And one of the most controversial elements of this law, there's several of them, but I'll just focus on this one, was this element of technical capability notices. In short, what this allows the government to do is if there's a technology company or company who's working in some form of communications, it's very broad. In Australia, the Australian government law enforcement can show up and kind of stand over them as they build in a new capability called a technical capability notice. And this really kind of alarmed people, like, well, what would this do? Would this introduce like a backdoor or systemic weakness into the communication system, which again would lead Australian journalists, for instance, to be concerned about the security of various platforms that might exist in Australia. And this particular law has been talked about of being overhauled by, say, like the likes of the Independent Monitor, but that hasn't happened yet. It keeps coming with the legislation in Australia. Most recently, there was the Identify and Disrupt Act, which gives the AFP and ACIC really quite significant hacking powers, and particularly allowing them to add, copy, delete, or alter data within any computer or data in transit that they can intercept and authorize to access. One particular outcome of this is that there's a new thing called network activity warrants, which basically allows them to target against electronically linked is the word used in the legislation, which who knows what that means, and that can permit then monitoring of a broad range of computers or devices, even when they don't know maybe who the device belongs to. So that you can see how that can capture quite a wide net that can capture things like journalists and sources quite conceivably. And a lot of commentary has already identified that, you know, this is going to have implications for journalists as well as others. And then just to round off this, there's also been something called the International Production Orders Act, which was introduced, which was basically Australia and United States kind of getting together and teaming up to kind of be quite open and liberal in the kind of sense of sharing quite a lot of access to data in both Australia and the United States, going both ways, which means that, you know, US authorities might be able to access Australians' information, particularly if they're using US-based communication providers. So that would include these types of things. If Australians were using AWS, Cloudflare, Messenger, WhatsApp, and so on. I know WhatsApp's encrypted in the end and so on, but the point stands that if Australian journalists, for instance, were using any of these platforms in any particular way and part of their practice, they conceivably need to think about how US or also Australian law enforcement can kind of get access to that. So that's the kind of what's going on in Australia, where all this legislation has come into play. So we decided, well, let's kind of get a report on this and some outputs. So we interviewed 19 journalists, 2 media lawyers. We were focusing on those who are in investigative roles, of course, those who would be actually handling sensitive data, those who might be coming to the attention of public authorities. We tried for a balance across a number of outlets, and we were really focusing on 2 questions. One was about the knowledge, awareness, and confidence with information security and cybersecurity concerns, as well as the specific impacts of these recent electronic surveillance laws on their practices. And then we spoke also with a couple of lawyers as well, who kind of give us their particular input. So what did we find? And this is kind of the original sort of stuff. Well, when it came to the cybersecurity preparedness of journalists, I'm sure it's not too much of a surprise to maybe some people who know this literature existing already, that consistent with all the research, it's pretty clear that Australian journalism needs to kind of improve in the sense of the capabilities in newsrooms around their ability. There was a long tail of journalists who told us that they basically didn't have particularly high confidence that they were actually prepared or understood how they could basically deal with sources in the contemporary age in a way that they would actually protect them. A lot of them were finding hard to uphold their obligation to be able to protect sources and offer that type of promise. Some of them were just basically saying they didn't think about it enough, or they were really just learning, but they really could do more. And a few of them kind of really admitted that this is not something that they had been thinking of particularly strongly. And it wasn't, something they had give too much thought. So that there's kind of some alarming stuff there. Given that that was a chunk of the journalists, there also was people who have been described by Jennifer Henriksen as like security champions. We did find that people in newsrooms who did have some skills or like had kind of put a bit of extra attention into understanding this thing. These were the people who could actually tell us and talk to us about like what Tor was or what Tails was and when you would use Tails or what secure drop was. In fact, they were largely the people who would ultimately be the ones who would actually advocate for the implementation of secure drop in their newsrooms. And so they became a kind of go-to within their newsroom, which they had significant skills, but let's not overplay it. They didn't obviously have computer science backgrounds or anything particularly like that. They were just self-teaching what they could. But they had concerns themselves about their ongoing ability to actually manage information security developments, because things move really quickly, as people know, in terms of new vulnerabilities can emerge, new threats, new surveillance powers, of course. And even though they were the best of the crop, they were often aware too of how quickly that skill set can decay. General theme of journalists having to really upskill themselves and not really having institutional support. I don't know if this would be a surprise to people. Here's a bunch of quotes they kind of really provided us that it was really, up the top there, media organizations cut you loose basically was kind of a lot of the main message, that they basically just had to DIY. It was all a case of institutions, even the ones who did provide some kind of workshop, or a seminar once in a while, a lot of the journalists didn't feel that was particularly good. And then we talked with a bunch of journalists from organizations that just didn't do diddly squat, and the journalists themselves just had to be, as it says here, it's up to the individual journalist just to make sure they're secure. And really, as someone said, you're really mad if you're waiting for your organization to help. You just have to kind of figure it all out yourself, which is a steep learning curve for a lot of this stuff. What we did find, though, the particular Australian story was quite interesting, which was that the raid of the AFP on the ABC, which was quite shocking, was described as a bit of a holy shit moment by someone, which meant that it was a real jolt to people's understanding and awareness and kind of concern about these issues. And it actually has kind of helped almost in this question in terms of putting journalists and organizations on high alert, raising a bit of institutional awareness. I don't want to overstate this, but it did allow some of those, at least laggards, or amongst the journalist cohort, to like at least start to adopt things like using Signal or Proton Mail. And then some of the orgs themselves have started to think, oh, well, we have to plan for the fact that the AFP have been more aggressive here than we might have expected in the past. And how do we perhaps think about that and act on it? If I switch now over to talking about the impacts of the actual surveillance laws themselves, we asked journalists flat out, did this impact your reporting or how you reported or how you went about it? And a lot of them were really at pains to kind of give us the answer to that was no, that it had no editorial impact. They would not cover a story just because of these laws. This could be a bit of bravado, or a bit of or occupational pride, that they don't want to kind of appear cowed by these types of things. And it's kind of hard to get at the question of like, what stories might have happened or haven't happened as a result of these types of laws in place. As it was kind of said, by someone, all journalists like to think of themselves as martyrs, and we're kind of would still kind of do the stories, even though with law enforcement, and particularly in Australia, could be kind of hot on their tail with these types of things. They did outline a number of other major impacts, though, which kind of maybe what people might have expected. Loss of sources was people, some journalists could specifically talk to actual examples of losing sources. You know, for instance, one talked about, and this was a political journalist, if I remember correctly, who basically had to drop contact with a particular source in a major Australian institution because they were certain the source was being watched, and the source themselves was aware of how risky it was now to talk to journalists. They talked about sources making mistakes. So a source might reach out in an insecure form of communication, and then basically it becomes clear that, well, if we go ahead with this story, you're kind of hanging out there in the wind, and you've actually kind of maybe already blown your cover if we go ahead with that. So that people have lost stories that way, and sources had to withdraw whenever conversations about security measures got to a more complicated level. And one journalist described things like you've been handed a USB, and then the source probably thought they were being very sneaky, but then the journalist was able to just look at the right click author of the Microsoft Word document and see who actually it was, which was a concern and impacted the story. And similarly, what they were very much saying is that the journalists were convinced, at least, that there was a major impacts on whistleblowers, as well as just the practice of whistleblowing in Australia by these electronic surveillance laws. People were just kind of saying things like this. It was far more difficult to protect sources and whistleblowers these days. I felt that there was clearly a massive chilling effect on stories. Some people cited the metadata retention scheme in particular, about how that made it really fraught and really tricky to make sure that kind of, from woe to go in terms of how you're contacting sources, that you don't actually inadvertently blow your cover by leaving some kind of trace that could be picked up quite easily subsequently by law enforcement in a warrantless way, as I would like pointed. And as summed up by one journalist, the laws they feel were put in place to fuck over whistleblowers basically was what was articulated as being what they thought the motivation behind these laws in particular. So to kind of wrap that up, basically what we kind of found was Australian newsrooms, like many others around the world, and the literature on journalsec is really showing that, have themselves generally low confidence in their levels of cybersecurity preparedness. It's just something they don't prioritize necessarily. It's just something that they don't have the time, often the budgets, expertise, and capabilities often to kind of be at the level you would kind of hope, or the standards you would expect. Ironically, the AFP raid on the ABC, as well as another journalist, Annika Smethurst, has kind of jolted a bit of Australian newsrooms into kind of having a stronger level of self-reflection around their own data security, as well as the organizations themselves have had to kind of reckon with this possibility, which is, I guess, a kind of silver lining out of that story. But don't want to overstate it. Institutional support for these issues was still really quite low, and the predominant approach was like, if you're a journalist and you're handling sensitive information, if you're dealing with sensitive sources, it's really on them to actually kind of go about understanding what they need to do and how they need to protect themselves and their sources. There was a widespread belief, as well as a number of practical examples, of how the surveillance laws, specifically in Australia, that unique kind of story, had been impacting upon the willingness of whistleblowers to actually either A, come forward, or even be able to build those relationships and then follow through with actual disclosures through to the point of actually going public and live with their stories. So really, these surveillance powers were kind of seen as a part of a climate of basically antagonism and aggression that journalists in Australia had never really, well, they were saying to us anyway, characterizing it, that they'd never had seen such aggression, particularly those raids on the ABC by the now former Australian government, who were the federal government in place during the introduction of all those laws I described, were the Liberal government, which are the Conservatives in international parlance. Yeah, and that this kind of overlapped with whistleblowers being pursued aggressively in these other cases in Australia, which I'm not going to touch on at the minute, and that there was generally, a culture of secrecy that they were significantly worried about. So that about wraps it up. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of our particular report. We kind of get into much more detail in the full thing, which will be available for interested parties very soon. But yeah, hopefully that kicks off today's discussion, and we're happy to kind of circle back and answer anything that I might have skipped over.
Thanks very much. I'm actually, while it's a bit out of the program, I'm going to say if anyone has any very quick questions for clarifications for the Australian team, we've got a couple of minutes and maybe for Diarmaid and Monique, if there's anything in the chat you want to kind of comment on, we've got a few minutes that we can do that.
I see Alan's got his hand up.
Hello there. I just really enjoyed the presentation, and my background's technology, and so this is, it's something I had never considered, the risk specific in journalism. What I'm interested in is there any element of the cyber industry that are providing support to journalists, even some sort of baseline level of here is best practice, or is it literally coming down to the journalist trying to find what it is they need to know?
That's a good question. There's a lot out there of kind of like orgs, journalistic orgs, or like the International Consortium of Journalists and so on, that put out various guidelines and pieces of advice, and put together bits of programs. And there's things that are merged that are deliberately designed, like SecureDrop is designed specifically with like whistleblowers and journalists in mind. So you get, in terms of when you say industry, I'm trying to think of like examples of private industry who kind of reach out and do things. I'm sure there might be examples. Monique, do you have any thoughts or examples to mind?
What immediately springs to mind on this is like organisations such as Blueprint for Free Speech here in Australia, and the work of Sulat Dreyfus and others that are in that area that have been working on a series of principles in relation to some of the ways in which journalists can better protect their sources. And I'll put some links into the chat that speak to those. And I'm also aware of some other groups who are working with, for example, human rights defenders in parts of Southeast Asia, and attempting to enhance their technical capabilities in terms of protecting themselves and some of the cyber hygiene around this. But I'll put some of these links into chat.
And just very quickly on follow-up, is there potentially any private sector firms out there that see this as a commercial opportunity? And do you think there's appetite within journalism who would potentially consume those services? So to say you are the experts and we really need to benefit from your expertise, and either independent journalists or journalists who work for a bigger organisation would be willing to fund that. Is there any sense of an appetite for that?
So from the folks that we talked to, like, we didn't get the sense that they were engaging with that. Like, there is things like we in Australia and elsewhere, you get like these like encrypted phone handset companies like EncroChat and so on, which have all this association with organized crime and so on, but that's a whole other story. If you go to their websites, they often say, oh, that our phone is security hardened, it's got like a privacy hardened or security hardened form of Linux like flashed into the device, and it has all these encrypted channels in and out of it, and you never, and this is your ultra privacy. In fact, Eric Prince, the guy from Blackwater, I think, is now trying to launch one of these phones, and they often pitch it to journalists, or like journalists are in their list of like, we sell to lawyers, we sell to high-end CEOs, and we also sell to journalists. So that is part of their advertising. We didn't find purchase at the other end of that in terms of it didn't come across to us that the cohort we were speaking to were engaged at that level. So like if that does exist, they weren't engaging with it at what we spoke with anyway.
We'll do a quick, okay, there's two people who want to make comments, so let's do it very quickly and then we'll go to our presentation. So Nick, you're first.
Oh, sorry, very quickly. Yeah, I mean, the griftification of privacy tech is quite interesting with the Eric Prince thing. But I was quite interested in that sort of that holy shit moment with ABC. And I'm just interested to see, has that translated to any structural realization, you know, in terms of better cybersecurity training? Was there any, did that move the dial at all, or at least sort of start forming any sort of conversations within journalistic fields or adjacent fields, or was it like a spike but it sort of went back again? Just out of curiosity.
Short answer is yes. It started organizations at least having the conversation. Maybe that conversation isn't where it should be. And also we saw a lot of Australian journalists quickly get on Signal and Proton Mail and things like that when they would just maybe have just been laggards up until that point. So there was a bit of, there's a story there. There is something.
Eileen Ormsbury, you have a question or a comment? Eileen, we can't hear you. I don't know if you're speaking, but at least I can't hear you. Maybe others can.
No, I can't hear anything.
I'll hear you now. I think if not a bit faintly, but if you want to try and ask, go for it or speak.
Yes, I was just wondering, I know that some overseas news companies have onion presence, so like The Guardian and the New York Times and even the CIA have onion sites on the dark web in order to help whistleblowers upload things anonymously. Has there been any talk of any Australian places having the same sort of dark web presence for that exact purpose for whistleblowers?
Yes, so like a number of the org, like particularly like the ABC and Guardian Australia and so on, now use SecureDrop, which I believe is a .onion mechanism. So that yes is the answer, but we also scanned what how a lot of the orgs inform sources to come to them, and still some of them are just asking them to kind of send emails to. They're just at domain.com.au addresses, which is probably not advisable. So it's interesting that there's orgs here kind of doing the right thing, and then there's orgs here kind of way behind.
All right, I think we're going to pause questions for another sort of while, and we'll go to our presentation. So Heather, can you please put up the other slides? Thanks. All right, so thanks everyone. So I am going to present on behalf of my project team on the sibling research that we did in Scotland on a very similar theme. So I have been a collaborator, particularly of Dr. Monique Mann for many years. I used to live and work with her in Australia. And so we actually ended up applying for some funding as a collaboration between Australia and Scotland to extend the project on the themes that you've just heard about to Scottish journalists. And the project was funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh as part of a series of grants that they have to encourage research networks between Scotland and countries in the Asia Pacific region, including Australia. So the project, we worked very closely with Monique and in formulating the project. Then we were thankfully very successful to get some funding, and they have been kind of mentoring and advising us along the way to kind of do this Scottish component of the research, which is very much based on the kind of work that they have done and the approach that they have taken that we've just heard about in Australia. What we did in the context of these 9 months is firstly conduct a literature review of cybersecurity, surveillance and journalism and the Scottish context. And then over the last couple of months, over what is our summer, because we have Australian people here, I know it's not been your summer, but over our summer, we conducted new research in the form of 10 interviews with Scotland-based journalists in July and August. Dr Elaine Robinson, our qualitative research specialist, analysed and coded the interviews, and we are launching our report today. So what you can read in the report is, very new research, hot off the press, on the basis of these interviews and background research, and a very big thank you to the journalists who participated in this research, because without them, we wouldn't have been able to do it. One thing to kind of note at this point is I think that the journalists and others that our Australian colleagues interviewed did have some kind of investigative journalism aspect. We ended up interviewing a much kind of broader range of journalists, some of whom did work on kind of more sensitive topics, some of whom were investigative journalists, but we also interviewed some journalists and who were maybe not working exactly on these themes. So in that sense, we probably have I would say maybe a slightly broader sample, even though there's only 10 of them, but they are people who, some of whom were very kind of specialised in topics that might cause controversies, others were not. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I mean, some of this background is stuff that you know already and have just heard. I mean, we have the multi-purpose or multi-faced nature of digital technology for journalists as well as kind of anyone else, that they facilitate various aspects of work, make things like information gathering and dissemination a lot easier, but they also pose risks or create cybersecurity risks and can facilitate new and different forms of surveillance. Overall, there's ongoing concerns for a number of issues for journalists and their sources in Scotland and elsewhere with regards to free expression, privacy, defamation, as I've mentioned quite a bit in the chat, and we'll maybe come back to a bit later, and also data protection, which existed prior to digitalisation, but in certain aspects are kind of heightened as a result. There's not a huge amount of research on Scotland already. I mean, we are a small place, so maybe that kind of figures. But actually, in general, there's not an enormous amount of research on UK journalists, and particularly UK journalists in different parts of the UK, because different parts of the UK have their own context that we'll come to a little bit more later. But some of the only pre-existing research was conducted by Scottish Pen, looking at writers in Scotland, and some of our colleagues, I think, with us were involved in that. I think David McMenemy and Nick Williams, I think you were involved in that or conducted that previous research. So that was looking at writers, not just journalists, but it did find that there were chilling effects from surveillance, particularly after the Snowden revelations from 2013. We also see in the more recent context that UK journalists have been targets of Pegasus spyware, although to our knowledge, or at least from what is publicly available, not Scottish-based journalists. It seems it's been more journalists based in England and particularly London. But if those who are following the Pegasus issue will know that, every so often more information comes out. So at least publicly, we're not aware of any Scottish journalists being targeted, but other colleagues in the UK have been. Overall, from the literature, we see that journalists and media institutions internationally have a range of views, skills, and resources regarding cybersecurity and information security. Some very skilled, some very well resourced, some quite concerned about the risks. Others not so skilled, not so well resourced, not that concerned or not that aware of the risks. So there's a lot of, we're conducting this research in the context of quite varying views, skills, approaches to these topics. A bit more kind of on the general UK context leading up to our research. As I've mentioned already, the Snowden revelations in 2013 were a real major kind of incident about the extent of Five Eyes surveillance, including the UK and Australia. We also had particularly the Guardian targeted, well, who were disseminating information about the leaks, ended up having to kind of smash up their computers because the police in England, and I think it was the Metropolitan Police, were concerned about their potential non-compliance with various areas of law, I think around official secrets from memory. But obviously that was quite a kind of dramatic event, both in terms of understanding the levels of surveillance that existed in the UK and elsewhere, and also in that particular impact on a group of journalists. As I've mentioned, there are quite different situations in different parts of the United Kingdom. In Northern Ireland in particular, there's quite challenging conditions for journalists. There have been police raids on investigative journalists in Northern Ireland, and also a journalist who died, Lyra McKee, in the context of unrest in Derry. So that is obviously a particular situation in this context, but also, you know, these can have impacts on the practice of journalism and also interactions with the law beyond Northern Ireland as well. Lots of concerns, although throughout the UK and beyond, with journalists' cyber and physical safety, online harassment of journalists becoming quite a big issue that I'll come back to a little bit later. An ongoing issue in the UK too, related to WikiLeaks and the US, and to some extent Australia, is the ongoing extradition issues around Julian Assange, which I think others perhaps have done who are gathered here today, have done quite a bit of work on, but that is kind of an ongoing issue, and also relating to topics about kind of what is a journalist exactly. Finally, we have had some cyber attacks which have targeted journalists and journalism in the United Kingdom, at least ones that we know of, because there's quite a lot apparently that go on that we don't know much about or are not publicised. Paul Mason was the subject of a hack and leak attack earlier this year, possibly by pro-Russian elements. And Bella Caledonia, a pro-independence, Scottish independence that is, website, kind of web journalism site, has been subject to quite a prominent denial of service attack, and actually crowdfunded for more security and more secure information resources as a result, in particular because the site didn't have resources for a higher level of security. We also have lots in the way of cybersecurity strategies and policies in the UK, some of which do recognise, and I think there's increasing recognition of the particular nature of cyber attacks on the media, on journalists, and the impact that that may have with regards to democracy and our political system more broadly as well. So our research is took place in the background of quite a lot of complex issues, both for journalists internationally and also kind of in the UK specific scenario. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip on to talking about some of the interview findings. So we looked at all these kind of background elements. We adapted interview questions that our Australian colleagues had used a bit more for the UK and Scottish scenario. And I'm going to kind of present in the next few slides just some of the sort of headline findings that we have gathered from these interviews. So with regards to Scottish journalists, or Scotland-based journalists, because they weren't all actually Scottish as such, awareness and preparedness about cybersecurity issues and surveillance, they recognised various different kinds of cyber threats and from various different sources. So I think our Australian colleagues, one of the big threats seems to be from kind of the Australian government and police. Our interviewees recognised threats from a number of sources. Yes, in some cases, UK government and police, particularly if they were working on stories and investigations that might be kind of controversial or sensitive, but also from other threats from other countries as well. So China and Russia were also mentioned as kind of potential state actors that could pose cyber and surveillance risks. A range of companies, so corporate surveillance, if stories were being done that might be critical in certain ways or investigating into companies' activities, that was also a concern. Criminal organized crime, another concern, and just individuals more generally, which relates quite a lot to the online harassment issue and what can transpire from that. Journalists were generally aware of, or were all aware of, and to some extent concerned about surveillance from different sources, but they were also pretty resigned to its existence, and it was kind of something that they had to operate within. As regards the legislation in the UK that we go into a little bit more detail in the report, journalists were broadly aware of UK legislation around things like surveillance powers, such as the Investigatory Powers Act, but on the whole, they didn't have much in the way of detailed knowledge, which I think is actually quite different from what some of the journalists that our Australian colleagues interviewed. They seem to have more detailed knowledge of the surveillance laws in Australia. Some of the journalists we spoke to as well also thought that there were probably more protections for journalists and their sources in UK law than actually exist in reality, and one in particular was quite perturbed to hear that actually that what they thought wasn't quite the case. As I've mentioned already, the journalists viewed online harassment as being a really big issue for them and their work, and they actually associated it with cybersecurity risks and as something which could lead to surveillance. We didn't actually define what we meant by cybersecurity and surveillance when we spoke to journalists, so it was really around kind of what did they associate it with. They could interpret our questions, and almost all of them, I think all of them actually, did mention online harassment of journalists as being a really big issue. Another issue too is access to resources around cybersecurity, and to some extent also around legal support as well, especially if they got into a bit of a difficult situation with the law as a result of investigative activities. So that was a really big issue that was mentioned by many of our interviewees. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so as regards the impact that cybersecurity and surveillance risks had on the journalists we spoke to, they used various tactics to address the threats and risks that they perceived or knew about from cybersecurity and surveillance, and perhaps differently to some of the Australian journalists, quite a few of our interviewees mentioned that they actually preferred not to use technology at all to avoid any sort of online cybersecurity issues, which are by their nature online or digital, and also surveillance, whether online or offline surveillance. So they actually had a preference in some cases for that. Didn't make this point in the report, but I do wonder whether our geography maybe makes it easier to meet some people in person, at least in the big cities in Scotland anyway, versus the Australian colleagues who maybe were working further away from, for instance, potential sources. Okay, so that would, in fact, a preference in some cases for offline meetings was a tactic that was mentioned by our interviewees. Overall, yes, the threats and risks did kind of give rise to concern among our interviewees about protecting sources and the security of communications. And similarly to the Australian interviewees, they didn't view surveillance as actually a deterrence to pursuing certain stories. They said things like, actually would make me more inclined to pursue certain stories, but of areas of law and powers defamation was a huge issue that was mentioned by many and mentioned as being much more of an impediment. The actuality of defamation, or the threat of defamation, was mentioned by many as being much more of a barrier to pursuing certain stories. There was also a lot of concern about the impact of online harassment, as I've mentioned already, and also what kind of impact that and resources issues for Scottish journalists would have on the future of journalists and journalism in Scotland overall. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I've gone over some of this already, or hinted at it anyway. Much of our findings are in line with the literature on awareness and impact of surveillance in journalism internationally, and also with the findings of our Australian colleagues. So commonalities: a lot of journalists have to rely on themselves in both Australia and in Scotland. However, various kinds of divergences. So I would say that overall, compared to at least the literature, the journalists that we interviewed were reasonably well aware of cyber and surveillance threats. The literature, as you may recall, I said different levels of awareness are noted, whereas I think everyone that we spoke to had some kind of awareness of them. And most of the journalists we spoke to adopted tactics and approaches to remain safe and secure, although these varied quite a lot. Difference as well compared to the literature is the significant concern about online harassment of journalists that our interviewees mentioned. With regards to Australia, I would say other divergences are that the move to encryption and secure communications were more pronounced in our Australian colleagues' work compared to the journalists that we spoke to, but that might also be part of the context that just Australian journalists are working in. Arguably more government antagonism, or there has been more government antagonism with the previous Australian government versus the scenario that the journalists in Scotland are operating within. Also, possibly because our sample was broader than investigative journalists, that may also have impacted on that. Another kind of aspect too is, in theory, and for now anyway, better human rights protections in Scotland and the UK. And in fact, aspects of the surveillance laws continue to be under challenge, including further impact on journalists in courts in the UK. And as well, to kind of reiterate this point, while I've seen in the chat that maybe journalists in Australia were also quite concerned about defamation, that was mentioned a lot by our sample, and also online harassment as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so we came up with 3 recommendations because always good to have them at the end of a piece of research for policymakers, journalists, the journalism as a sector, and so on. So I think regardless of the fact that all of our interviewees had some awareness and undertook certain tactics and approaches to secure their communications, overall there should be more ongoing cybersecurity education and support for journalists and media organisations, and that kind of education and support might be different for journalists versus the organisations that they work for. Some of the journalists that we spoke to, if they had had any cybersecurity training, sometimes it was just kind of standard corporate cybersecurity training that didn't really kind of go to the specific issues that they may need to confront with regards to protecting sources. And that was if they had any training to begin with. Also, the UK government does, have various policies and resources around cybersecurity, but given the nature of the work that journalists do, there were some of our interviews did kind of mention that it would be good for if the UK government already supports kind of media organisations as businesses, but we have to be careful about their interaction with journalists and their own cybersecurity, because one of the threats to journalist cybersecurity can also be the government, and can be law enforcement as well. A second recommendation, more legal protection, support and education for journalists. As I said, the journalists generally, if they had an idea about the law, it was quite a vague one. So, and they were in some cases a bit they didn't actually understand what the law was, or they actually had they thought there were more protections for journalist sources than there actually are. So I think that would be quite important, or we think it'd be important to kind of offer those kinds of protection, support and education. And thirdly, the Scottish Government actually has been considering the sort of ongoing sustainability of journalism in Scotland. There's been some policy work done around this, and an independent expert group as well, which issued various recommendations. My understanding and knowledge of that is that there wasn't really any discussion of cybersecurity issues within that. So I think it's important. I mean, some of the findings that we had about the ongoing sustainability of journalism in Scotland and the future of journalism in Scotland. I think there is a need clearly for that to be assured and also to be resourced as well, and that this needs to take account of cyber issues too. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so that's us actually perhaps a little bit longer over our time, but you can also find, I've added a link to the report, which is now available in and is officially launched now in the chat. So thanks very much. And I think before taking any questions, I'm actually going to invite our panel speakers to give their up to 3 minutes views or comments on each or on these topics and what they've heard already. So I might go first with Nick Williams, please.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I think also very quickly, it's a very poignant day. It's the 21st anniversary of the murder of Martin O'Hagan in Northern Ireland. His murder is still unsolved. There's no one been brought to justice, and that's 21 years later. The UK does have an impunity problem, especially when it comes to Northern Ireland. But I think both these studies are really interesting, and I think this hierarchy of threats, I think, is really important. So whenever we talk about cybersecurity, we may think about surveillance or state entities or non-state entities or Amazon or GCHQ, but actually we need to look at the threat environment as a whole. And so I think that's really interesting, and a very interesting distinction between the Scottish and the Australian model in terms of the hierarchy around defamation. And in Scotland, defamation was reformed last year. It is better than it was, but obviously, as the report has shown, it's still a long way to go until it is perfect. But I think both of them, while they show differences, they do show this very complex and very challenging media environment. And it does then raise the question, how can a journalist defend against all of these threats? How do they prioritize against these threats? And does that prioritizing create blind spots, which then increases risks elsewhere? And I think that's a real worry that we need to look at. We can't just look at these things in isolation. We need to look at the media environment as a whole. I know Scotland is looking at improving the public interest journalism. I think the report mentions the proposed institute that a working group has announced. The government's been absolutely silent on it. And I think that could be potentially good thing to help plot up that picture in a bigger sort of more detail. The other thing I'm saying is, like, we need to be again very clear, and it was interesting in the chat again looking at comparisons between Scotland and Australia. But the legal environment in the UK is eroding in terms of media freedom, and I don't mean to be too hyperbolic, but I think there's a very real concern that we are heading towards something that's very dangerous. Elaine in the chat mentioned the National Security Bill. We have the online safety bill, which is going to demonize the use of encryption. And we have whatever comes in place of the Human Rights Act. Bill of Rights bill has been shelved, but we have a Home Secretary who's called for us to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights. So when we talk about a framework, and at the moment the framework is stronger than Australia in terms of human rights framework and international standards, we don't know where that is. And all this is happening at the same time as newsrooms have less access to legal representation or in-house or on retainer, and new media, independent media, local, small, do not have any access. So it's all dependent on beg, borrowing, stealing, getting pro bono where they can, which is not sustainable. It's not substantial. And I think this is something that we need to be very, very aware of moving forward, because this is a very, very challenging environment. Yes, England and Wales have announced, well, the government has announced that England and Wales, they'll be moving forward with anti-SLAPP, so if people don't know, strategic lawsuit against public participation mechanisms. We don't know what it looks like yet. Raab announced it when he was in post, but that's not going to come into Scotland. So this is some things we need to look at. But I think, again, and I'll finish on this point, is looking at the report, and it does show how varied the ecosystem is. You know, you have different requirements for different people within one team, but you also, I mean, and I think it was really important to focus on freelancers as well, because their threat environment is so different and their access to resources is so different, and as a result their risk appetite may be different. But also the obligations for state entities, non-state entities, employers, unions, associations, you know, this is a very complex, and there's going to need to be resource coming in, you know, there's going to need to be expertise brought in and taking it seriously and systematically and structurally as well. Because this stuff, it can't just be, you know, there used to be the stage where in newsrooms there'd be one dude who, it used to be always dudes, let's be honest, because it's not exactly the most representative field, that knew all things tech, and that was person who knew tech. But every journalist now needs really to understand a baseline. You know, they need to be at a baseline of cybersecurity, and that is a requirement that they need support in getting to, and support they can count on both proactively and reactively as well. And so not just when something happens, but they need to have a level of comfort so they can go after the stories that could open them up to potential risks. So the focus on reactive and proactive protections and sustainable funding, I think, is key. And there's no answer to it, but it's something that we need to look for. And I think the reports really shine light into how this is sort of brought to bear in people's experiences across the spectrum, and not just investigatory journalists as well. Especially in Scotland, things like sports reporting is actually alarmingly dangerous. I mean, I was looking at covering some of the defamation stuff around the Rangers case, and that seemed to be, I was more worried about that than doing some of the international pen work, and that's unique potentially in its own peculiarities. But I'll stop there. But I think great work, everyone, for both the teams. They're remarkable reports.
Thank you very much, Nick. We do actually go into, I should have mentioned a bit more about the Scottish context, but football is like a hugely problematic area, soccer that is, for those outside of the UK. And yeah, really in a way that is probably quite unusual and strange to those from outside. I might go to Dr. Lockman Choi if you're here for your kind of comment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Lockman. I am currently a fellow with the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. But with Angela, actually, I was many years in Hong Kong before that, and I'm currently in Amsterdam. And I did a lot. It's really heartening to see a lot more research coming out on this topic. A couple of years ago, I was doing research in the context of Hong Kong and journalists. And this was before 2019, before the protests happened, and before the national security law happened. So of course a lot has happened since then. But one thing, and so this is about the research I did before that. And one thing that strikes me is how similar actually the findings are from like even though Hong Kong and Australia and Scotland are not exactly obviously like societies you would say are very similar, right? But perhaps there is something to the idea of like the culture of journalism, and journalists, that are more similar than the sort of national, characteristics of these places. And one thing though that I want to point out that I think is interesting, is one small difference is that I found that a lot of journalists were educated by the sources in the Hong Kong and China context. And that is because, like for the sources, there's oftentimes a lot more at stake, and they've been trained a lot more And then, so it should be sort of like a bit of a professional embarrassment for the journalist, if you ask me. And perhaps we're heading towards a point where, you know, like the sources are getting more and more trained than the actual journalists. But that was sort of like an interesting difference, I think, in this case. But having said that, you know, like the other thing I want to point out is that, you know, like after 2019, after 2020, you know, we all sort of briefly know like how bad, you know, press freedom has gone, you know, freedom in general in Hong Kong has gone. And so one thing that sort of puts in perspective is you know, how tech actually isn't that important. If you look at it, sort of the repression on press freedom in Hong Kong, they closed up, you know, they shut down news organizations, they put journalists in jail, and those are still the sort of very traditional, old school methods, you know, to repress on press freedom. And so that's just something to sort of you know, like keep in mind. It's, you know, like it's almost like a luxury problem. You know, I'm not saying this is a luxury problem that we're talking about, but it is sort of, you know, like there are much harsher you know, like things that we need to look out for. And then, so having said that, three things I want us to think about. You know, like we've done research all on sort of like the awareness, right, level of you know, like journalists right now, and how much they know, and that's sort of like a snapshot, you know, like a moment snapshot thing, right? And so what I would love for us to sort of think about also, and what, you know, like maybe some of the researchers, the writers of these reports can talk about this, is look at security as a process rather than sort of like a moment snapshot, you know, like, and so how do journalists actually learn about security, right? And the Australian report talked a little bit about, you know, sort of crisis moments, right? You know, like, and how then suddenly everyone gets jolted awake and so. And Henriksen talks about sort of security champions, right? And, you know, the one few people that, you know, everyone learns through. And then so, and I'm saying that because, you know, at least you know, like I'm not just doing this research just for sort of very objective reason. I really want to figure out how can we improve the state of journalism, right? You know, how can we improve this, right? And then so we need to know how they learn this stuff before we can, you know, because the other thing that I found was very ineffective are just sort of like, okay, here's what, telling journalists in a one-day workshop, here's what you need to do, you know, like, and they maybe remember one thing, you know, and if they even remember one thing, that'd be great, you know. But, you know, this is sort of obviously sort of like an ongoing thing, and telling journalists that they need to work on security is like telling them to go to the dentist, you know, like no one wants to do it. I think that's very clear from these reports. And then so, yeah, we need to figure out, you know, how do they learn about this stuff and how can we feed into these processes, you know. And so maybe it doesn't make sense to have like workshops, you know, where random journalists can sign up, you know, like, and maybe it's much more effective to draw in those security champions, you know, like the ones that are, you know, like sort of the node points in the social networks of all the journalists, right? And make sure they are very up to date on stuff, you know. So that's sort of like existing ways of, you know, like how journalists learn about security. And then sort of the other thing I want us to think about is what are new ways, right? And that's something Angela also talks about, right? We need more resources and more education, right? How can we do that? You know, like, and the one thing then, I assume most of us are in organizations that do sort of, you know, care about education, right? And then so what are we doing about this, right? You know, like, and there have been sort of anecdotal research about, you know, like the state of security education in journalism schools or, you know, like at universities in general. And at least looking in Hong Kong and looking in Canada and the United States that I know a little bit about, it's not a good look, you know, like, you know, we're making media law required course oftentimes, you know, which obviously is important, right? But like what we also know at this point is, you know, like if we really want to protect our students, you know, like, and teach them the skill that they need to in order to become good journalists, there's no way, you know, like cybersecurity, digital security is not part of that training at this point, right? It's not just media law. It's not just law, you know, law is code and code is law and so on, right? And then so that's something that, you know, like it's, you know, like something we need to think about, you know, how can we introduce that into our curriculum? And then last but not least, and this is sort of like a little bit more of a philosophical question for all of us, I think. What does a better world look like? Is that, you know, because we paint like, and this is our job as critical scholars, right? You know, we paint a picture where, you know, like this is not good, right? What's going on right now? But what does a world look like that is better, right? And is that, you know, like every journalist is super up to date and super skilled, and, you know, like I don't think that's the way out, you know, and you know, like it shouldn't be sort of this neoliberal model where we put all the responsibility on the individual journalists, you know, to be super up to date on tech and so on, right? You have a job to do, you know, like, and that job takes a lot of time and so on, you know, and I don't think that's ideal, right? I don't think we also can rely on law, you know, like, you know, to sort of protect everyone, you know, like, and there has to come a lot more from institutions, I think. But that's, you know, but like stimulating that kind of imagination, I think, you know, what does a better world look like, right? And is it just better security? Or can we also make the case that, you know, like, no, you need to have better security because this ultimately benefits journalism as a whole? And so is that something that we can, you know, like push a lot harder for, and or imagine a world, you know, like so Panama Papers, for example, I think is a great sort of example, right? Where you can tell journalists, hey, you know, like if you learn this stuff, you know, actually, you know, you're going to be able to do stuff that you could never done before, right? And maybe as researchers, we can start building sort of like indicators for, you know, okay, you know, like we know that, you know, like Angela's been doing that, you know, we're starting to, you know, a lot of it is so similar that I think it's important that we start to figure out what are the nuances and differences so we can actually tell journalists, okay, now you're moving to the needle, you know, you're getting better at this, as opposed to say, well, you know, like you've done all this, but it's still bad. There's still so much more you can do, right? And then so we need to sort of figure out, you know, like how can we show them that they're actually doing better? You know, maybe comparative research also in that regard, you know, is something that, you know, again, of course, this panel is something that's really, really important. So yeah, so what are existing ways that journalists learn about security, and can we improve that? You know, can we make interventions there? What are new ways, you know, like that we can introduce, you know, like in terms of teaching them? And more importantly, what does the better world look like, you know, for journalists, you know, in security, right? And so that's I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go to Alan Grieg to give his response or comment, please.
Hello again, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me along. I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the reports, the presentations, very insightful. I'm not part of this world, so just very quickly, my background, I started life with GCHQ on the protection side. And where there's a little bit of synergy within my own career, I then ran an organisation for 15 years where we protected online, it was online protection for high profile, high net worth individuals. So we had a service offering for celebrities, very different threat profile, very different threat actors, but there is quite a lot of synergy. And one of the things that we learned from that work is that we didn't really speak about cyber. In the main, we spoke about security because the risks actually transcended across technology and into the physical. And we spent quite a lot of time working with close protection teams, event security teams, and then we brought technology to bear where it was necessary. And one of the kind of key learnings which kind of may help is that we couldn't teach the principals the necessary skills to protect themselves. So even though we understood what the threat profile was and who the threat actors were, we couldn't provide them with the skills to protect themselves, and they were very reliant on us. And what we ended up doing was offering a solution where we wrapped them in security, if you like, and we actually took on the risks and worked to mitigate them as best as we can using closed solutions, physical security, and we worked a lot on protecting against online stalking and unwanted attention online. As someone that's worked for 25 years within the security industry and having listened to your presentations, could I sit down and spend time with journalists and actually help mitigate the risks? I think that's unlikely, because what I'm kind of learning from what you've all shared is that the risk profile and the threat actors constantly changes. If we look at the threats faced with the likes of The Guardian and Edward Snowden, that's at very extreme scale where we have, you know, international government agencies and, you know, foreign state actors, and that's just, you know, an absolutely different level. So I'll go back to Dr. Locke's point, and that is, where does the responsibility lie? Does the industry as a whole have a duty of care to be able to protect the sources and protect the journalists and actually offer some technical solution? The cyber industry or the security industry, is there a commercial opportunity where the security industry can bring solution to bear? So if we look to the future, can the security industry bring solution to bear to help provide journalists with a platform where many of these risks can be mitigated. I don't know. It's certainly something that I hadn't considered before. Certainly something I'm going to kind of think a lot more about, and I'm looking forward to actually reading the reports in more detail. And you know, for me, I'm going to reflect on this as a technologist to see what we can do as an industry to actually support journalism, because it's clearly the threat's growing and something really needs to be done about it. And I think placing the onus and the obligation on individual journalists to actually protect their sources and themselves is not going to be fit for purpose. And I think it's a big ask. And I think that if that is the solution, we're actually needing to take cybersecurity professionals and train them to be journalists is probably an easier solution than trying to train journalists to be cybersecurity professionals. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. And I'll go to our last, but certainly not least, respondent, Angela Shear.
Hi, sorry if I'm a bit croaky. It's my 6 a.m. now, and these are the first words I've spoken today. But thank you for inviting me. A little bit of background. I am a research fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics and Public Policy in the US. And I'm doing my doctorate in cybersecurity at the University of Oxford. Angela mentioned that I'm a digital Sherlock with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Lab. But what you don't know is I also work as a student employee of the National Cyber Resilience Centre group in the UK, which Alan heads up. So that's a cool connection for me this morning. And my work sort of combines a lot of the research that you've all been discussing and the questions that you've all covered, in that I focus on emerging threats to journalists from networked technologies, the newer ones, not so much laptops and phones or tablets, but smartwatches, fridges that talk and tweet and things like that. And so I look at those threats in democracies that are currently facing strains from outside influences and new legislation, and those include the UK and Australia as two of my case studies. And one thing that we've talked about a lot today is whose responsibility it is to protect journalists from cyber threats. And so that's something that I tackle in my research. I'm currently finalizing, hopefully, a prototype toolkit that includes a risk assessment framework, not just for journalists, but for various roles within the media. And that doesn't just include putting the responsibility on people within the media to deal with these threats themselves. It also looks at actions that cover collective action. So what kind of policy and legislative pressures can be made that will change the legal threats that have been discussed that might actually stop the states from being able to surveil people in the ways that they currently do. And so I was also lucky enough to get to read the reports a little bit early. And I have lots of thoughts, not just on the reports, but also questions that arose in my own research. Because Australia in particular, the press environment there is an area that I've looked at intensively. So I was particularly interested in seeing the perception of the 2019 AFP raids as signaling a new era of media information security. Because so my interviews all happened in 2020 and 2019, and it was really interesting because at the time there was a lot of panic. So the idea that this has inspired new protocols that will explicitly deal with mitigating similar threats in the future is exciting to me. And it's nice to see the report explicitly note the importance of standardizing responses, because I think that kind of information sharing is really important for motivating other organizations to consider following the same protocols. And I know that Angela mentioned the differences in Australian and Scottish geography, and that is something that I found in my research as a potential issue, not just for talking with sources, but also because of interactions between journalists and other members of the media. You don't get that same kind of informal out-of-office threat intelligence sharing that you do in places like London, where a lot of the old school legacy media companies are right next to each other, and so everyone goes to the same pub and talks about the weird things that have happened at work. And so formalizing those kinds of threat intelligence sharing networks within the media without making them really onerous is something that I have been trying to work out how to do as part of my research. And while I've also researched the press environment in the UK. I've not gone into depth in Scotland as a standalone case study, so it was really interesting to get the chance to read that report and to learn more about the challenges faced by the Scottish press in particular. And to me, there are two things that I really wanted to ask about. One is the point that you make about organizational attacks that limit functionality, like denial of service attacks. And in particular, the note that one of the pro-independence online magazines, Bella Caledonia, was fundraising to cover the costs of moving to a dedicated enhanced server. Because I think acknowledging the events that had happened, but also the costs involved and the changes that are necessary to protect against these kinds of threats in the future is a huge deal. I mean, other news outlets might see that line in the report and start thinking, okay, so these are scary things that are likely to happen to us or might happen to us, but there isn't nothing that we can do about it. It's not the death knell of our organization. And I think that might inspire more collaboration on protections that could potentially lower the costs in future. Fingers crossed again. But I would be curious to know whether your research showed that news organizations are learning from each other and supporting each other when this kind of thing happens. And if not, whether anyone spoke about why. And I'm also, I'll try and wrap up very quickly, but I'm also interested in the recognition about interviewees mentioning potential surveillance, but not always being aware of whether they'd been under that surveillance. This kind of uncertainty is also a staple of my research. And the one exception is another of my case studies is Taiwan. And the journalists that I interviewed in Taiwan were pretty sure that they were under surveillance, not from the Taiwanese government, but from Chinese forces. So it's not the same as the UK, Australia, and America, which are my other 3 case studies. But I would like to ask whether anyone here has any idea of how to deal with that kind of frustration that journalists experience because they know the risk is high, but quantifying it can feel impossible. And so does anyone have any thoughts on how to help journalists manage the stress that comes from knowing this is a problem while also lacking answers about whether surveillance has actually occurred and how, and who is surveilling them, which array of actors is involved? So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Angela, and thanks so much for joining us at a super early time, but it's really great that we've got participants across at least 3 continents, maybe even 4. So yeah, wonderful. There's certainly been a few questions raised, but at this point, I would like to kind of open the floor. If anyone, especially those who haven't spoken already, have any questions or comments that they would like to make, you can raise your virtual hand. And if any of the speakers have any, responses they want to make as well, please go for it. Nick.
You can go to David first because people are probably sick of hearing my voice, to be honest.
All right, I'm not, but I'll go with David as he hasn't spoken yet.
Thanks. No one's like hearing your voice, Nick, at all. Yeah, just some of the comments around the, the notion of knowledge of laws that specific journalists had just put me in mind when Alan and Julie were talking about how different professions perceive the different information laws that exist. I've taught information law to librarians, to information managers, to computer scientists, and not to journalists, but to people who work in politics as well. And it's really interesting. Everyone has a different philosophical approach to those laws. And I think that's a big part of this as well. So the idea that you get corporate training about how not to leak information when it's just generic corporate training, that's not really aimed at anybody philosophically. I guess it's an ass covering exercise for the organization. So there is something to be said, I think, for understanding particularly the needs of journalists and how they see these laws, because having taught the different types of professional, it is actually quite difficult to teach the same laws to computer scientists that you're teaching to librarians, because the starting point is different. For a lot of these laws, one might be much more protective, versus the focus might be much more about freedom of expression. So those aren't easy things to untangle, I think. So that just came up really in my mind when people were talking there.
Nick, do you want to go?
It was just based on what Julie was saying. I think this idea of the knowledge as to whether you have been surveilled and what that does to you as well. Because, like, for example, the study that me, David, and former colleague Lauren Smith, when I was at Penn, looked at was this survey on sort of self-censorship and surveillance in Scotland, was this idea of surveillance and perceived surveillance. Because, very few really have any, except for sort of very local offline surveillance. A lot of the times they may not know. But the idea of there being a weight of a perceived surveillance, and that almost doing it, even if they're not being surveilled, could exert the same pressure on you, even if you are being surveilled. And that, I think, is a really interesting and challenging dynamic with surveillance. And one of the things that I've always tried to look at, especially when I've done like training for journalists or human rights offenders, is this idea of, like, for example, like threat modeling or risk assessment. So trying to be as granular as possible to understand that person within their circumstance, and not to a newsroom and not to a team, but to an individual. And so, because whenever people think of surveillance, they think of GCHQ or NSA or these sort of things, whereas sometimes it may be your neighbor, it may be in very local cases it could be an abusive partner, it could be a competitor, things like that in your team. And knowing what your threat environment actually is, not what you think, that can sometimes help identify where the real pressures are. Not necessarily, you won't know 100% all the time, but at least you may have a fairer idea, and that may help you respond better. And I think that conversation needs to be had, and I think how people are embedded into this conversation about security. So it's not just, like, as I said in the chat, not an imposition, it's something that actively responds to their work environment and is seen as something that improves their and strengthens their journalism, and not something they have to do as like a box ticking exercise or an insurance requirement. Can maybe help them get a better idea as to their risk level, and then also what steps they can take to respond to it as well. And I think that's it is a challenge, but I think we're hopefully moving in the right direction.
And Julie?
So to David's point about corporate OS covering, I think it's really interesting that one of my findings has been that there is effectively a conflict of interest between the security trainers that are hired by news organizations and the journalists that are trying to do their work. And it's because it's not often the fault of the cybersecurity trainers, it's that they are being pigeonholed into offering sort of rote security trainings that don't enable journalists to carry out their work to the full extent that they want to. So it's seen as a hindrance. And then, so separating, one of the recommendations that I'm making in my papers is separating the cybersecurity measures that are necessary for securing a news organization as a corporate entity, which is still important, and the mitigations that are necessary for journalists themselves and for other members of the media. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. And then to Nick's point about knowing who the actors are and what the threats are versus the sort of overwhelming sometimes perception that you are under surveillance or under attack. I think part of the issue is this muddying of the waters about whether or not, which comes from the risk that journalists are facing, not just being related to the work that they do themselves, but the work that their colleagues do. I mean, the big reason why any actor, usually other than for money, attacks a journalist or is surveilling a journalist is because they're using them as a pivot point to access other people, right? And sometimes that's sources, sometimes that's other journalists, it could be their audience even. So I think part of the difficulty in accurately estimating what the risk a journalist faces is that they're not just taking on individual risk, but also are responsible in part for the risk faced by their colleagues.
Alan.
if I can just follow up on the discussion around surveillance. So from my own experience, I've worked on a number of high-profile stalking cases where the principal or the victim was subject to technical and physical surveillance. And the mental health impact on them is significant, and that usually stems from the art of the possible. So they don't know what is actually possible. And on occasion, they kind of defer to kind of popular culture or Hollywood to understand to what extent they are being subject to surveillance. And I've seen some very high profile public figures who ability to earn money requires them to be in the public eye and to, you know, go out to events and attend public events, who would no longer leave their homes and who would no longer walk the streets or attend these events because they didn't know who the threat actor was. And at that time, it's, you know, as a technologist or as a security practitioner, the first step is, you know, this is the extent of the risk you face, and here is some of the mitigations that we can actually implement. But for me, it really was a case of we don't know what we don't know. So we don't know, are we being subject to surveillance? To what extent are we being subject to surveillance? And what is the art of the possible? So we spoke earlier on about a lot of smart devices, smart fridges, smart tellies, smart watches, and all of that. And I have seen, you know, very accomplished people remove all these things from their homes as they start to consider that these potentially could be a point that could be used in that kind of wider surveillance. So there's definitely, you know, a very strong discussion needs to be had around the mental health impact on certainly journalists who are subject to any sort of surveillance. And then it goes back to my earlier point about duty of care. So, you know, they're all employees of someone. Some of them may be employees, they may be self-employed. But I think as an industry, there has to be consideration to this and the support, not just in technical or security solution, but also on the impact on them as individuals.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to kind of say a couple of things. Firstly, in response to the question about, well, Bella Caledonia was very public about its, you know, security threat or attack. Actually, other people that we didn't manage to get an interview with Bella Caledonia. Unfortunately, I think I can say that because it would have actually been really interesting to hear more about that. But some of the other interviewees, including for big, you know, well-resourced organizations, they did say that, you know, actually what Bella Caledonia went public about is happening to a whole lot of other media organizations and, you know, freelancers and small outlets, small and big outlets in Scotland. But they, in many cases, if they are subject to a cyber attack, particularly one with a kind of clearly criminal element, they've been going to the police, and the police have been telling them not to go public about it. So I think there's probably quite a lot more going on that we don't hear about. To what extent there's sharing between different institutions and organizations about these issues, I don't really know is the answer. I don't think it clearly came up in any of the interviews, although my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong. What there was sharing of was, and similar to what we heard in Australia, journalists individually, you know, talking to their friends and colleagues about how to kind of be more secure and sharing experiences. And many of them pointed to, you know, a particular friend or colleague who was more knowledgeable or perceived to be more knowledgeable than they were, and that they would go to this person for advice, but it wasn't often usually something formal at all. And just on the point that Alan's made about threats and the impact of them, certainly a lot of the journalists we spoke to who had been the victims of online harassment or who knew friends and colleagues who did speak quite a lot about the mental health impact of that. And there were also quite different approaches to social media from different journalists and also organizations as well. Some actually didn't really want their journalists to have big social media profiles, maybe just especially on Twitter to tweet out stories and that's it. Others were more encouraging of, you know, their journalists having a profile, and for some kind of individual journalists, especially freelance, they had different approaches as well. So I think that would be interesting to study a bit more, probably not by myself, but around kind of social media approaches, because it seemed there were quite different approaches to some extent, depending on the organisation and also the area that the journalist worked in. And I mean, as well as football and Glasgow rivalry between the teams, Celtic and Rangers, which actually kind of in some ways is a proxy for sectarianism, other kind of really controversial topics in the specific Scottish context were anything around like the independence debate, and as well as controversial topics more broadly, so stories around like race and gender, which I think is an issue in other parts of the world as well. But the Scottish specific stuff that was really causing, you know, online harassment in particular were things around anything to do with Celtic and Rangers and anything to do with the Scottish independence debate, which particularly the latter bodes a bit ill if there is going to be another independence referendum next year. So if journalists are experiencing a lot of harassment on the basis of writing stories about this, how is this going to work in terms of having a sort of public democratic conversation? Nick, your hand is up.
It's just about the solidarity and information sharing between outlets and individuals, because I think there's a huge problem about that, and not just in Scotland, but I think in Scotland it's more pronounced because we're a relatively small country and a relatively small media ecosystem. I remember when working on the defamation reform campaign in Scotland, just the lack, and getting different newsrooms in a room, and just the lack of knowledge as to what threats others have faced, and then actually realizing that they're very similar threats or they're the same claimant, but they just hadn't had that sharing. And obviously with legal cases, there's always the jeopardy of it enhancing the legal jeopardy. And we see this across Europe, you know, encouraging journalists who are being threatened with slaps to go forward and using public and publicity as a vehicle, as a weapon to defend themselves against slaps. And I think there needs to be a similar sort of conversation about more coordinated online threats, whether it's DDoS attacks or bot farm, you know, whatever it may be, it not being a show of weakness or something that will see as threatening their bottom line, as something to come forward, and maybe there is a shared way. Also speaking out, if one journalist is attacked, and this has been most of my life for so long, is trying to encourage journalists to write about other journalists being threatened, or encouraging them to speak out when that happens. Sometimes it does happen, but it's not as responsive and fast as it should be, or in my opinion, as it needs to be. So I think that's something I think can definitely be improved, but it's not necessarily just a Scotland specific situation, but I think just the size of us, it maybe feels very pronounced just because of the small scale of our population.
Thanks. Does anyone else, especially maybe those who've not spoken, want to say anything? So, Cielito, I hope I pronounced your name okay.
Yes, you did. Thank you. It's well pronounced. Hi there. My name is Cielito Sarabia. I am right now studying in Dundee, and I'm originally from Bolivia. I was a digital security officer there, and right now I'm also a fellowship for the Internet of Rights of Article 19. I just wanted to chime in a little bit. I've been really interested in the whole conversation that's been going on today. First of all, I know that there's been a lot of talk about what can the industry do, what can civil society do about these issues. And to be honest, from my fellowship, what I've seen is that it's not enough. Sometimes between industry, civil society, academia, and other actors that are part of this internet, ecosystem, I've been personally very frustrated about how much what our reach is. So for me, to be honest, I've been seeing that it's probably interesting as well to try to see if we can have a stronger voice in other bodies, in other internet bodies, like technical and policy frameworks within internet. You know, I've been working right now with ICANN, the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers, and also identifying that there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. So whatever civil society or academia or probably the industry can do, right now there's other bodies as well where we need to have a voice and have a perspective from human rights and probably a gendered perspective as well. In Bolivia, I actually don't work a lot with journalists. They're a very special type of public. I work a lot more with activists. And right now, I see a lot of similarities with what's been happening and what you guys been talking right now. There's a lot of harassment, surveillance and stuff. But what we've also seen is that groups of people that come together to talk about what's been happening is much more effective to try to identify a perpetrator or like somebody that's been trying to attack them than having to use sophisticated tools to try to identify their attackers. So, and this goes on a little bit on the line of what was being mentioned about mental health. These groups of people that come together and just talk about their issues really seem to have like a really good effect with them. And I wanted to say one more thing, but I don't remember what it is. I'm sorry. I'm just, I'm still a bit jet lagged from my trip from Bolivia to Dundee. So, but I'll be in the conversation still.
Thanks so much, and it's really great to hear from you and your work. And please kind of stay in touch because definitely quite a few things I think in common or common interests. Does anyone else want to say anything or make any comments, especially if you've not? Elaine.
Hi, I'm Elaine. I worked with Angela and David on the Dundee report. I just wanted to reiterate the points about kind of the mental health toll in terms of surveillance and particularly harassment, particularly for freelance journalists, because even if there are systems in place for people to get kind of training, just the kind of mental health and physical toll it takes. Some of the journalists we were talking to talked about how they could maybe go and get training, but they had so much other work to do that at the end of the day, they were just exhausted and they couldn't even think about putting more training on. And it's journalism's in a kind of precarious space as it is without having to think about things like, you know, cybersecurity. So I think just the mental health toll and like just more resources for journalists is definitely needed at just a kind of fundamental base level from organisations, from training organisations, from employers.
Does anyone else want to maybe have make a fine or Morven?
Oh yes, sorry, I haven't. I don't know if you can hear me. I haven't used Teams very much and I don't know how to find the comments and I hate missing out on anything. So could somebody please tell me, I'm on a laptop, how do I find the comments?
You should have a button that says chat somewhere. I also, yeah, I'm sorry, I think quite a few of us are not big fans of Teams either, but that's kind of what we've got. There's a button that says chat and that if you can find that, you should be able to find the comments.
Okay, all right, I'll keep looking. Thank you. And thanks for this session. I'm really enjoying it.
Thanks so much for coming. Anyone else want to, I think we should probably kind of finish up. So if anyone has any sort of final comments or responses that or questions even they would like to make, this is your opportunity. Elaine.
Oh, can you hear me? I think I was muted there. It was just a quick point when we were talking about the uncertainty. I don't think that it helps that a lot of the laws can be quite vague, particularly in the UK. Just now we were talking about the National Security Bill, which could mean that journalists might be subjected to, you know, the same kind of treatments as those under investigation for espionage. And then there's also the worrying kind of discussion about the Official Secrets Act, which was just about information security, but now it might include things like, you know, information that is prejudicial to the UK's safety and interests, which isn't exactly clear what that is like contained within that. So I think that's another kind of scary thing that's particularly in the UK just now, is just the discussion of amendments to laws and how vague that can be.
Thanks. David.
Yeah, just one quick addition. building on what Alan said about the tyranny of the unknown, about not knowing who it is that's actually doing it. Way back in 2005, I was working on online sectarianism as a topic, and we did a report for Nil by Mouth, the Scottish charity. And actually, one of the people that got in touch to ask us about the research was actually someone who was one of the main perpetrators of the sectarianism online in an anonymous format. We only knew because a wonderful journalist actually knew who everyone was and said, look, watch, that person is actually this person. And it was obviously were phishing, but they were doing it in a professional capacity. And I won't say who they were, but it was like little things like that happen and you don't know, and they're looking for you to say anything. One little line, it could be the thing they use against you. So yeah, I think Alan's absolutely correct. He's obviously done it on a much bigger level than we did, but that was quite eye-opening for us, just not knowing who the people are that are actually perpetrating this stuff. Their professional capacity was completely different from the online persona, but it was someone who was actually trying to fish for information to try and attack us. So yeah, always be wary, I guess, of that.
Thanks very much, Angela.
I keep accidentally remuting myself because my laptop is very slow. I just wanted to say thank you because this has been really interesting, and it was great to hear from so many people whose work I've read or whose presentations I've seen but not actually been in a virtual room with before. And I just wanted to reiterate that I am currently researching emerging threats from network devices. So if anyone is interested in collaborating either in industry or on the cybersecurity side or on the journalism side, I would be very up for that. So thank you again. And the reports were brilliant.
Thank you very much. Maureen, your hand is still up. Do you want to come back in? I actually might ask Diarmaid and Monique if they want to make any final comments. They don't have to, but if they do, this would be a good moment.
I'll just make a few comments, and Monique, if you want to come in a sec as well. Yeah, no, thanks to everybody for all the nice comments and all the different aspects of the discussion. Just a few things to kind of wrap up what people said. Like Angela was asking about, was there cross-institution collaborations? We didn't find any. We felt it was very much everyone was fighting their own war in separate little spots. And in terms of training, I kind of what Lachlan was saying is kind of resonating with a lot of my thoughts of. I didn't want our report to have a kind of trite conclusion of there needs to be more training because, well, what would that look like? What would that mean? And you kind of have to meet where journalists are. And I think people have nicely encapsulated that there's all these other competing pressures on their time and their job, and then once you get into the questions of freelancers and so on who are really out on their own, and what would trying to train and support those individuals look like, and how can you possibly build upon that? Like, how do they learn? I think is a really terrific question that Lachlan raised, which is something I've been thinking about in terms of, well, how do you meet them where they are in terms of how would you build in that type of educational experience within their actual flow of work, or how would that actually look? So those are real questions that I've kind of been thinking about, and we're going to launch our full report next week, and we've got some journalists on the panel to actually kind of start to unpick some of those thoughts of as. Given all of these other pressures, how would that actually look? But I'll just also say, in response to Lachlan as well, I haven't given up on the legal reforms that we feel in Australia for sure that there's a few things that really could be done quite relatively soon and relatively quickly that would make things certainly better, if not perfect, of course. So thanks to everybody for all the comments and contributions.
Perfect. That's a great segue to me. Thanks, Diarmaid. I just wanted to say I've painted a very dystopian picture of Australia in the chat and the comments and also within the report, but I don't want to be so dystopian and hope to end on something a bit more optimistic, which is that we've recently had a change of government, and there's a lot of stuff happening in relation to reform about Australia's legislative framework in telecommunications surveillance more broadly. They're moving to repeal all existing telecommunications surveillance law and replace it with a consolidated Electronic Surveillance Act. This is all happening kind of right now, and I think a key moment, particularly in the Australian context, to try and advocate for some meaningful changes and protections for journalists, and other areas as well. So just today, the new federal government has introduced a bill into our parliament establishing a federal anti-corruption commission, which will hopefully also come along with some whistleblower protections and a few other kind of significant reforms. So while in the report and the context of the presentation has been very negative, I think that there's a lot we can be doing in terms of organising and trying to make some changes as well. So I just wanted to end on that, and thanks Angela and all of the other speakers for having us.
Thank you so much. Can you, either Dermot or Monique, can you put a link to your launch in the chat, please, in case anyone would like to attend? Hopefully it's not in the middle of the night for us, but it would be great to attend as well. I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Just to say thank you very much to everyone for coming. Thanks very much to all of the speakers. So particularly to Monique and Dermot, who are kind of going into their evening, quite late in their evening in Australia. So really great that we could manage to reach you and organise something together, hopefully in person one of these days, one of these decades maybe. Thank you so much to our panellists. So that's Nick Williams, Dr. Lockman Choi, Alan Greig and Anjali Shear. Also particularly thanks to Anjali for also phoning in really early in her morning as well. So really appreciate it. A big thanks to all of the audience. Thanks a lot to all of the journalists who participated in our research. Also thanks to Nick Williams and Jubanes Abdullah for advice and guidance on the Scottish part of the research as well. Thank you so much to the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science, where I'm based at the University of Dundee, for always supporting my work and particularly the strong commitment to public engagement. So thanks very much to Niamh McDade, our Centre Director, and thank you hugely to Heather Doran and Clara Morris, who are our public engagement specialists and who have also kept this event going and done a really great job to support us. So I think that's all the thank yous, but that's really can't do this without you all, and certainly very interested in continuing these discussions. I think there's quite a lot in there, and continuing them in a more kind of international sense as well, and perhaps to kind of throw something a little bit different in there. Also I'm quite interested in exploring some of these topics for other professions as well as journalism, where there might be particularly sensitive relationships. That might be the medical profession, the legal profession, because I think, again, we need to look at these kind of professions in a profession-specific way, but there are certain kind of private, confidential relationships that need to kind of be cyber secured as well, and that can also be subject to surveillance. So just to put that out there, that's what I'm interested in too. There's an evaluation form, so if you have attended and can complete that, that would be really useful for our purposes in terms of understanding what's worked well, what hasn't worked well. Hopefully nothing hasn't worked well, but also for how we plan future events as well. So again, thanks very much. Thanks very much to everyone from tuning in all around the world. I think I count now 4 continents, so that's really fantastic. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully see you at some point soon. Thank you. Thanks everyone for speaking and making this really great. I really appreciate it. To our